In this debate, we have a clear sense of agreement between both teams. Both teams are agreed that the concessions and nature of energy resources currently in the third world are exploitative. The difference between the two teams is that we think government ownership of those resources is the best way to ensure long-term economic and social prosperity in those nations, whereas the opening opposition from Cork just think we need to tickle the revenue stream a little bit more, raise the tax rates, and do it that way. It's not going to be a particularly exciting debate as a result, except this podium is about to collapse, which might provide some sort of level of interest. In this speech, not only am I going to uphold this podium with one hand alone, I hope, I'm going to ask the three simple questions we have to ask in this debate. The first, can these resources be realised through government ownership? Secondly, why government ownership matters above private taxation. And the third is how this model particularly strengthens taxation and particularly strengthens governance in the third world, ladies and gentlemen. So firstly, ladies and gentlemen, can these resources be realised? The first contention of these guys, and I would say it is even more ridiculous than this, is that the government somehow don't have the expertise to do this. We would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that the expertise to mine and the capacity to mine and exploit energy resources is not particularly high-tech. Saudi Arabia managed to do it in the 1960s and the 1970s through Aramco. Venezuela manages to do it today. But more importantly, we think there's also a market for service provision and sharing of expertise in this regard from Western mining companies who are happy to provide technology to be able to exploit these things. So we think there's no issue about whether the governments are going to be able to do it. The second question we have to ask ourselves is why ownership matters. These guys basically just wanted to run nationalism light, saying we just need to renegotiate the concessions. It's entirely unclear what that meant as opposed to just renegotiating ownership, because presumably if the problem is tax, you just raise the tax rates, ladies and gentlemen. But we think there are certain institutional problems in doing that, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's just hard to raise tax because these companies often don't report their profits in the same way. They don't give results and give a full account of their revenue stream. But we also think there's just problems of generally raising taxation in some of these countries because they don't have the institutional power to do so. But what they do have, ladies and gentlemen, is we can ensure that the profits are more likely to stay at home and more likely to go into these countries if we can guarantee ownership. To that extent, we think more of the profits are still going to stay in these countries, and we think given the enormous demand for mining resources, matched with the incredible economic inequity and poverty in these countries, that the prioritisation and maximisation of profits within these countries is incredibly important. The second thing we would say, ladies and gentlemen, as to the merits of ownership rather than just taxation, is that industrial practice matters. We think that the record of Western mining companies in Africa on providing things like jobs to local people is nothing short of scandalous. They basically just fly in people like Alex Ward to do their bidding and employ no locals, ladies and gentlemen. We think in the long-term economic interests of Africa, it's important that these people be given jobs. The second area we say that's the case is with regards to environment. When we look at the most scandalous environmental practices done by Western companies, it's done by people like Shell in Nigeria, not the Nigerian government. Then all they wanted to say was that somehow China is bad at mining, and therefore that's a reason why all governments are going to be environmentally irresponsible. We say, ladies and gentlemen, China is a totalitarian regime that's not like most of these democracies in Africa that are going to control these resources. We think they're infinitely more accountable. But the important point, ladies and gentlemen, is that the incentives are very different. Because they own the land, because they're not around just for the short term, they're naturally more likely to care about the long-term nature of these resources, the long-term sustainability of the resources, and the social implications of how these resources are used. I'm going to take a point, sir, but I'm going to have to hold on for dear life.
The only arguments that you've provided are against regulation on the part of the state. If the state, as you contend, can't regulate, then explain to us why you believe the state can maintain these resources.
Well, because I think most states have the capacity to do so. It's very simple, ladies and gentlemen. There's a demonstrated empirical fact that states can run mining companies. We see it in all Middle Eastern nations. We see it in places like Russia. We see it in Venezuela. It's more likely that they're going to be able to do so through ownership than through tax. The second thing we would say in regards to why ownership matters is that the problem is in fact concessions. There just isn't enough private investment coming into these countries to realise these resources. We pointed you to the example of Zambian copper, where American mining companies basically just own all of the mining concessions for copper in Zambia. And that because they have more profitable things to do, they just don't invest in them. They don't exploit those resources. The only way to exploit those resources is to just take the concessions from them. That's the only way Zambia is ever going to be able to realise its enormous copper wealth. The final question we have to ask ourselves in this debate is how this actually strengthens governments in the third world. We say the first way in which it does is it guarantees a revenue stream that these countries are lacking and simply haven't been able to raise through, say, taxation. The second thing it does, ladies and gentlemen, is because ownership of these assets is important, it's going to allow these governments to borrow. And before these people say it's going to ruin private investment in these countries, we say it's still compensation on just terms, so it's not going to affect any private investment. It's only going to strengthen the hand of the government. All these people that could then say is that it's going to create a populist form of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not opposed to popular opinion having a role in democracy. We think it's very important. The second thing that we would say is regards to this whole question of a political tool. That the difference in this case is that they're not superpowers like Russia, they're much smaller, but so it's going to be a smaller scale. But that's exactly the point, ladies and gentlemen. If they're going to have this control, it strengthens the hand of these governments against, say, the IMF, which made them privatise these mines to begin with. We think it's time we enhance the bargaining power of these countries, because that's the only way we can ensure some sort of institutional equity and governmental quality. Ladies and gentlemen, it's often said that the sun has never set on the British Empire. We agree, it's time to fix it.